Hello. Welcome to, I've lost track of the days. But considering it's chapter 7, and I don't think we've taken any breaks, I believe this to be the 7th day of the Song of the Lark. And I lost, no, it's over there. Is it? Yes. I lost my other book, but it's okay. I know exactly where it is at all physical moments. So, God rested? What did he do? Rested from what? um oh, yes, that's true. God will not be with us today. God is not joining us for our stream today. They're occupied doing other things. Yeah, I have no, as usual. Oh, yesterday I was writing a little bit. I should also plug in my computer. But I wrote for the first time in a couple of. How we doing? Internet still unstable. Okay. Oh, perfect. My internet is no longer unstable, and I'm back. Yeah, so it was just really weird. I don't know what that was about. I'm also wearing a black turtleneck today, and this black turtleneck is my favorite piece of clothing. It's just like so reliable. It's so good. You can pair it with anything, and it will look perfect. So here's to black turtlenecks. I also think it's cool how it's just kind of like a void and there's like no definition. We love to see it. I wrote about in one of my assignments, there's a scene from the Alfred Hitchcock Rebecca where one of the characters always wears like a totally black dress. And if you don't like throw light on it purposefully, it looks like this, and it's just like this void of black, and she's obviously like, ooh, a nefarious character, because that's how people like to use the color black, and how we've been conditioned, like, from the Bible to treat the color black, which is not very forward thinking. And in our own writings, we should strive not to equate blackness with badness. So let's do it. Okay, let's do our quote from How to Be an Antiracist with that thought as well. So, forget what quotes I chose. Ooh, okay. So I'm going to read a full paragraph today, which is about capitalism and racism. And Ibram X. Kendi basically like says that like capitalism and racism are like conjoined twins. They can't be separated. And it's like, ooh, that's sexy. That's like a sexy thought. But I just thought that was such a cool way to put it. And so I'm going to read this quote about capitalism, which we do not love. Okay. In doing so, these conservative defenders are defining capitalism. They define capitalism as the freedom to exploit people into economic ruin, the freedom to assassinate unions, the freedom to prey on unprotected consumers, workers, and environments, the freedom to value quarterly profits over climate change, the freedom to undermine small businesses and cushion corporations, the freedom from competition, the freedom not to pay taxes, the freedom to heave the tax burden onto the middle and lower classes, the freedom to commodify everything and everyone, the freedom to keep poor people poor and middle-income people struggling to stay middle income and make the rich people richer, the history of capitalism, of world warring, classing, slave trading, enslaving, colonizing, depressing wages, and dispossessing land and labor and resources and rights, bears out the conservative definition of capitalism. Bam. Take that, you capitalists. So, anyways, it was just really cool because, like, essentially he was positing that, like, capitalism becomes a thing at the same time and completely concurrently with the slave trade. So, Let's not make ourselves beholden to that system. And he was also talking about, like, there's an Elizabeth Warren quote that's like talks about a different way of doing capitalism, that like there can be a way to have capitalism in a way that is not racist and actually like does promote business and things like that, but that's not the capitalism that we operate under today, and that like certain political groups and companies will promote themselves. So billionaires should not exist. Ding. What is Jeff Bezos now? A trillionaire? Yuck. Okay. We gotta find a better movie service than Amazon Prime. All right. Let's do some Song of the Lark. I did some research yesterday because I was like, now, wasn't Colorado originally a part of Mexico? And the answer is yes. So this book was written to be based in 1890, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo happened in 1850, I believe. Maybe it was maybe it was 60. Ooh, I messed it up. Anyways, there's only a 30-year difference between the time in which Colorado was part of Mexico and the time in which this book is being written. So it's really interesting that the Mexican characters are portrayed as moving in when this land was theirs 30 years prior, and that these people who live in the town likely lived through, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, because they don't like to teach us about the Mexican-American War, but likely lived through the Mexican-American War. Like maybe not Dr. Archie, definitely not Thea, but certainly someone in this town lived through the Mexican-American War. And at some point in the past, it seems like this town is more than 30 years old, was actively living on Mexican land. So, food for thought. Just to like think about the history of like the erasure of Native peoples in the Western narrative, that like this is America, these people are moving in, but they're like not really. So food for thought about the Western genre and like any sort of media that emerges around stories of like the frontier and early Americas and current Americas. So much to think about. Excuse me. Okay. All right, let's do it. The Song of the Lark, Part 1, Chapter 7. Thea's 12th birthday had passed a few weeks before her memorable call upon Mrs. Diamandis. There was a worthy man in Moonstone who was already planning to marry Thea as soon as she should be old enough. Good Lord! She's 12! His name was Ray Kennedy. Oh, my God! His age was 30! And he was a conductor on a freight train, his run being from Moonstone to Denver. Oh my God, that's disgusting. That's worse than Marianne, right? Maybe it's not. Oh God, I gotta do the math. Okay, 18 years. That's horrifying. Oh no! Marianne and Colonel Dashwood beat them by 1. Wait, Colonel Dashwood. Colonel Brandon. Thea's 12. Okay, well. Oh my God. Oh. Nope, indeed, Shiv. Nope, indeed. Okay. Ray was a big fellow with a square, open face, a rock chin, and features that one would never happen to remember. He was an aggressive idealist, a free thinker, and like most railroad men, deeply sentimental. What? Thea liked him for reasons that had to do with the adventurous life he had led in Mexico and the Southwest, rather than for anything personal. She liked him too because he was the only one of her friends who ever took her to the sand. What do you mean, her friends? He's a 30-year-old man. You're not friends with 30-year-old men at 12? The sandhills were a constant tantalization. She loved them better than anything near Moonstone, and yet she could so seldom get to them. The first dunes were accessible enough. They were only a few miles beyond the Kohlers, and she could run out there any day when she could do her practicing in the morning and get Thor off her hands for an afternoon. But the real hills, the turquoise hills, as the Mexicans called them, I feel like that's not actually what they called them, but you just didn't feel like putting in the name in Spanish. I have to agree. He would simply die. Were 10 good miles away, and one reached them by a heavy, sandy road. Dr. Archie sometimes took Thea on his long drives, but as nobody lived in the sandhills, he never had calls to make in that direction. Ray Kennedy was her only hope of getting there. Thea is like stuck between these insipid, like older male characters. What's gonna become of this? This summer, Thea had not been to the hills once, though Ray had planned several Sunday expeditions. Once Thor was sick, and once the organist in her father's church was away, and Thea had to play the organ for 3 Sunday services. But on the first Sunday in September, Ray drove up to the Kronberg's front gate at 9 o'clock in the morning, and the party actually set off. Gunnar and Axel went with Thea, and Ray had asked Juan to come and to bring Mrs. Diamantes and his mandolin. Ray was artlessly fond of music, especially of Mexican music. He and Mrs. Diamantes had got up the lunch between them, and they were to make coffee in the desert. Is there no one? She's talked to no one her own age. She has no friends of her own. When they left Mexican Town, Thea was on the front seat with Ray and Juan, and Gunnar and Axel sat behind with Mrs. Diamantes. They objected to this, of course, but there were some things about which Thea would have her own way. As stubborn as what the hell? Nope. Okay. When they passed the Kohlers, old Fritz and Wunsch were cutting grapes at the arbor. Thea gave them a business-like nod. Wunsch had come to the gate and looked after them. He divined Ray Kennedy's hopes, and he disturbed every expedition that led away from the piano. Distrusted. Sorry, not disturbed. Unconsciously, he made Thea pay for frivolousness of this sort. As Ray Kennedy's party followed the faint road across the sagebrush, they heard behind them the sound of church bells, which gave them a sense of escape and boundless freedom. Every rabbit that shot across the path, every sage hen that flew up by the trail, was like a runaway thought, a message that one sent into the desert. As they went farther, the illusion of the mirage became more instead of less convincing, a shallow silver lake that spread for many miles, a little misty in the sunlight. Here and there one saw reflected in the image of a heifer turned loose to live upon the sparse sand grass. They were magnified to a preposterous height and looked like mammoths, prehistoric beasts standing solitary in the waters that for many thousands of years actually washed over that desert. The mirage itself may be the ghost of that long-vanished sea. Ooh. Beyond the phantom lake lay the line of many-colored hills, rich sun-baked yellow, glowing turquoise, lavender, purple, all the open pastel colors of the desert. After the first 5 miles, excuse me? I agree, Shiv. All I want to do is read her descriptions of places, but not men. Okay. After the first 5 miles, the road grew heavier. The horses had to slow down to a walk, and the wheels sank deep into the sand, which now lay in long ridges like waves, where the last high wind had drifted it. 2 hours brought the party to Pedro's Cup. My tongue sometimes doesn't know what it wants to do. It's trying to roll the R's, but there's only one R, honey. To Pedro's Cup, named for a Mexican desperado who had once held the sheriff at bay there. The cup was a great amphitheater cut out in the hills, its floor smooth and packed hard, dotted with sagebrush and greasewood. On either side of the cup, the yellow hills ran north and south, with winding ravines between them, full of soft sand which drained down from the crumbling banks. On the surface of this fluid sand, one could find bits of brilliant stone, crystals, agates, and onyx, and petrified wood as red as blood. Dried toads and lizards were to be found there too. Birds, decomposing more rapidly, left only feathered skeletons. After a little reconnoitering, Mrs. Diamantes declared that it was time for lunch, and Ray took his hatchet and began to cut greasewood, which burns fiercely in its green state. The little boys dragged the bushes to the spot that Mrs. Diamantes had chosen for her fire. After lunch, Thea sent Gunnar and Axel to hunt for agates. "If you see a rattlesnake, run. Don't try and kill it," she enjoined. Gunnar hesitated. "If Ray would let me take the hatchet, I would kill one all right." Mrs. Diamantes smiled and said something to Juan in Spanish. "Yes," her husband replied, translating. "They say in Mexico, kill a snake but never hurt his feelings. Down in the cot country, muchacha," turning to Thea, "people keep a pet snake in the house to kill rats and mice. They call him the house snake. They keep a little mat for him by the fire, and at night he curls up there and sits with the family just as friendly." Is this true? I want a house snake. That sounds so sweet. Gunnar, oh boy. Okay, we're just gonna skip that part. I don't know. Okay. By this time, the south wall of the amphitheater cast a narrow shelf of shadow, and the party withdrew to this refuge. Ray and Johnny began to talk about the Grand Canyon and Death Valley, two places much shrouded in mystery in those days, and Thea listened intently. Mrs. Diamantes took out her drawn work and pinned it to her knee. Ray could talk well about the large part of the continent over which he had been knocked about, and Juan was appreciative. "You've been all over pretty near," he commented respectfully. Ray, who had taken off his coat, wetted his pocket knife thoughtfully on the sole of his boot. "I began to browse around early. I had a mind to see something of this world, and I ran away from home before I was 12. Rustled for myself ever since." "Ran away?" Juan looked hopeful. "What for?" "Couldn't make it go with my old man, and didn't take to farming. There were plenty of boys at home. I wasn't missed." Thea wriggled down in the hot sand and rested her chin on her arm. "Tell Johnny about the melons, Ray. Please do." Ray's solid, sunburned cheeks grew a shade redder, and he looked reproachfully at Thea. "You're stuck on that story, kid. You like to get the laugh on me, don't you? That was the finishing split I had with my old man John. He had a claim among the creek, not far from Denver, and raised a little garden. Okay. Sorry, I lost my place. And raised a little garden and stuff for market. One day he had a load of melons, and he decided to take them to town and sell them along the street, and he made me go along and drive for him. Denver wasn't the queen city it is now by any means, but it seemed a terrible big place to me, and when we got there, if he didn't make me drive right up Capitol Hill. Pa got out and stopped at folks' houses to ask if they didn't want to buy any melons, and I was to drive along slow. The farther I went, the madder I got, but I was trying to look unconscious. When the end gate came loose, and one of the melons fell out and squashed. Just then a swell girl, dressed all up, comes out of one of the big houses and calls out, 'Hello, boy, you're losing your melons.' Some dudes on the other side of the street took their hats off to her and began to laugh. I couldn't stand it any longer. I grabbed the whip and lit into that team, and they tore up the hill like jackrabbits. What the hell? Them damned melons bouncing out the back every jump, the old man cussing and yelling behind, and everybody laughing. I never looked behind, but the whole of Capitol Hill must have been a mess with them squashed melons. I didn't stop the team till I got out of sight. Then I pulled up and left him with a rancher I was acquainted with, and I never went home to get the licking that was waiting for me. I expect it's waiting for me yet." Thea rolled over in the sand. "Oh, I wish I could have seen those melons fly, Ray. I'll never see anything as funny as that. Now, tell Johnny about your first job." Ray had a collection of good stories. He was observant, truthful, and kindly, perhaps the chief requisites in a good storyteller. Occasionally he used newspaper phrases, conscientiously learning in his efforts at self-instruction, but when he talked naturally, he was always worth listening to. Never having had any schooling to speak of, he had, almost from the time he first ran away, tried to make good of his losses. As a sheep herder, he had worried an old grammar to tatters, and read instructive books with the help of a pocket dictionary. By the light of many campfires, he had pondered upon Prescott's histories and the works of Washington Irving, which he bought at a high price from a book agent. Mathematics and physics were easy for him, but general culture came hard, and he was determined to get it. Ray was a free thinker and inconsistently believed himself damned for being one. When he was breaking down on the Santa Fe, at the end of his run, he used to climb into the upper bunk of the caboose, while a noisy gang played poker about the stove below him, and by the roof lamp read Robert Ingersoll's speeches and the Age of Reason. Ray was a good-hearted fellow, and it had cost him a great deal to give up his God. He was one of the stepchildren of fortune, and he had very little to show for all his hard work, and the other fellow always got the best of it. He had come in too late or too early on several schemes that had made money. He had brought with him from all his wanderings a good deal of information, more or less correct in itself, but unrelated and therefore misleading. A high standard of personal honor, a sentimental veneration for all women, bad as well as good. And what does that mean? What is a bad woman? Maybe we pretend Ray is 13. Maybe we just think. Okay. And a bitter hatred of Englishmen. Thea often thought that the nicest thing about Ray was his love for Mexico and the Mexicans, who had been kind to him when he drifted, a homeless boy, over the border. Okay. He spoke Spanish fluently, and the sunny warmth of that tongue kept him from being quite as hard as his chin or as narrow as his popular science. While Ray was smoking his cigar, he and Johnny fell to talking about the great fortunes that had been made in the Southwest, about fellows they knew who had struck it rich. "I guess you've been in on some big deals down there," Juan asked trustfully. Ray smiled and shook his head. "I've been out on some, Juan. I've never been exactly in on any. So far, I've either held on too long or let go too soon. But mine's coming to me all right." Ray looked reflective. He leaned back in the shadow and dug out a rest for his elbows in the sand. "Narrowest escape I ever had was in the bridal chamber. If I hadn't let go there, it would have made me rich. That was a close call." Juan looked delighted. "You don't say. She was a silver mine, I guess." "I guess she was. Down at Lake Valley. I put up a few hundred for the prospector, and he gave me a bunch of stock. But before we got anything out of it, my brother-in-law died of the fever in Cuba. My sister was beside herself to get his body back to Colorado to bury him. Seemed foolish to me, but she's the only sister I got. It's expensive for dead folks to travel, and I had to sell my stock in the mine to raise the money to get Elmer on the move. 2 months afterward, the boys struck that big pocket in the rock, full of virgin silver. They named her the Bridal Chamber. It wasn't ore, you remember. It was pure, soft metal you could have melted right down into dollars. The boys cut it out with chisels. If old Elmer hadn't played that trick on me, I'd have been in it for about 50,000. That was a close call." "I recollect. When the pocket gone, the town go bust." I don't know what the hell that means. "You bet, higher 'n a kite. There was no vein, just a pocket in the rock that had some time or other got filled up with molten silver. You'd think there would be more somewhere, but nada. There's fools digging holes in that mountain yet." When Ray had finished his cigar, Juan took up his mandolin and began to play Kennedy's favorite, Ultimo Amor. Ultimo? See. It was now 3:00 in the afternoon, the hottest hour in the day. The narrow shelf of shadow had widened up until the floor of the amphitheater was marked off in 2 halves, one glittering yellow and one purple. The little boys had come back and were making a robber's cave to enact the bold deeds of Pedro the Bandit. Juan, stretched gracefully on the sands, passed from Ultimo Amor to Fluvia de Oro, and then to Noches de Algeria, I think, playing languidly. Everyone was busy with his own thoughts. Mrs. Diamantes was thinking of the square in the little town in which she was born, of the white church steps with people genuflecting as they passed, with round-topped acacia trees and the band playing in the plaza. Ray Kennedy was thinking of the future, dreaming of the large Western dream of easy money, of a fortune kicked up somewhere in the hills, an oil well, a gold mine, a ledge of copper. He always told himself when he accepted a cigar from a newly married railroad man that he knew enough not to marry until he has found his ideal and could keep her like a queen. He believed that in the yellow head over there in the sand he had found his ideal, and that by the time she was old enough to marry, he would be able to keep her like a queen. That's so weird. It's so weird. You could have had it all, right? But you had to be weird. Shiv, to your most recent comment, I think that's what it. Yeah, you right. He would kick it up somewhere when he got loose from the railroad. Thea, stirred by tales of adventure of the Grand Canyon and Death Valley, was recalling a great adventure of her own. Early in the summer, her father had been invited to conduct a reunion of old frontiersmen up in Wyoming near Laramie, and he took Thea along with him to play the organ and sing patriotic songs. I'll get it right now because I have it. I'm gonna get it out of my bookshelf. There's a excellent play about the brutal murder of a young gay man in Laramie, Wyoming, called the Laramie Project, that we did in high school. And Shiv, you were in that with me, right? We were all in it together. It's, oh man. I don't remember a first reading. I have like a strangely bad memory with, Just Bird. It's just, if you get a chance to read it, it's a pretty short read, but it's really incredibly written. And basically what they did was this theater company went to Laramie, and it's very recent. It was, I don't know when it was written. Copyright is 2001, but the theater company went to Laramie, Wyoming, like maybe a year or so after it happened, after this huge media I don't know if I said why. The play is about the brutal murder of a young gay man. So they went there after this huge media uproar, and like everybody was getting involved. And they got interviews from like everybody, and basically did like the found footage version of a play. It's like a documentary play, sort of. And so there's like, I don't know, 45 characters, and we probably had a cast of like 20 to probably like 15 to 20 kids, like playing different characters. But it's a very, very powerful piece. So if you get a chance, it's just interesting that Laramie was mentioned. Give it a read. It's a very good play. Yeah, Matthew Shepard. Okay, I'm gonna go back to this. Let's see. Okay. There they stayed at the house of an old ranchman who told them about a ridge up in the hills called Laramie Plain, where the wagon trails of the 49ers and the Mormons were still visible. The old man even volunteered to take Mr. Kronberg up into the hills to see this place, though it was a very long drive to make in one day. Thea had begged frantically to go along, and the old rancher, flattered by her rapt attention to his stories, had interceded for her. They set out from Laramie before daylight, behind a strong team of mules. All the way there was much talk of the 49ers. The old rancher had been a teamster in a freight train that used to crawl back and forth across the plains between Omaha and Cherry Creek, as Denver was then called, and he had met many wagon train bound for California. He told of Native Americans and buffalo, thirst and slaughter, wanderings in snowstorms and lonely graves in the desert. The road they followed was a wild, beautiful one. It led up and up by granite rocks and stunted pines, around deep ravines and echoing gorges. The top of the ridge, when they reached it, was a great flat plain strewn with white boulders, and the wind howling over it. There was not one trail, as Thea had expected. There were a score deep furrows cut in the earth by heavy wagon wheels, and now grown over with dry, whitish grass. The furrows ran side by side. When one trail had been worn too deep, the next party had abandoned it and made a new trail to the right or left. There were, indeed, only old wagon ruts, running east and west and grown over with grass. But as Thea ran about among the white stones, her skirt blowing this way and that, the wind brought her eyes tears that might have come anyway. The old rancher picked up an iron ox shoe from one of the furrows and gave it to her for a keepsake. To the west, one could see the range after range of blue mountains, and at last the snowy range with its white windy peaks, the clouds caught here and there on their spurs. Again and again, Thea had to hide her face from the cold for a moment. The wind never slept on this plain, the old man said. Every little while, eagles flew over it. Coming up from Laramie, the old man told them that he was in Brownsville, Nebraska, when the first telegraph wires were put across the Missouri River, and that first message that ever crossed the river was westward the course of empire takes its way. That's like I think I wrote yesterday that and in my novel, in my American novel about I don't know, the American dream, but I think that's like a somewhat progressive phrase of I guess it feels progressive today because empire is something that we equate with badness and domination, so it doesn't feel as forgiving as other phrases, but of course she still could have meant it forgivingly or beneficially, but okay. He had been in the room when the instrument began to click, and all the men there had, without thinking what they were doing, taken off their hats, waiting bareheaded to hear the message translated. Thea remembered, part of me thinks, and this is literally just a very, very, very limited thing and very personal to me, but empire is always bad in Star Wars. It's the Emperor Palpatine, The Empire Strikes Back. Star Wars. Look what she found. She found a way to make it about Star Wars. But I'm sure that George Lucas was not the first person to call empire bad. And British imperialism is to some British people and supporters was a good thing, but to most people, especially people who were colonized by the Brits, imperialism is bad. So I think it depends on what side you fall on there. Interesting. And I don't know when Reagan was president, to be honest with you. But maybe and I know that some, okay, I don't know. All right. An interesting thought. All right, let me see where we got. Okay. Thea remembered that message when she sighted down the wagon tracks toward the Blue Mountains. She told herself she would never, never forget it. The spirit of human courage seemed to live up there with the eagles. For long after, when she was moved by, when she was moved by a 4th of July oration or a band or a circus parade, she was apt to remember that windy ridge. How interesting. Today she went to sleep while she was thinking about it. When Ray wakened her, the horses were hitched to the wagon, and Gunnar and Axel were begging for a place on the front seat. The air had cooled, the sun was setting, and the desert was on fire. Thea contentedly took the back seat with Mrs. Diamantes. As they drove homeward, the stars began to come out, pale yellow in a yellow sky, and Ray and Juan began to sing one of those railroad ditties that are usually born on the Southern Pacific and run to the length of the Santa Fe and the Q system before they die to give place to a new one. And that's where I'll stop for today. I lost my bookmark. Oh, there it is. I stuck it up. Okay. Okay, 83. I don't know. Because with Reagan, Star Wars, I know I'm back at Star Wars. Star Wars came out in 77. But I don't know when the last one came out. I suppose I could look at my poster. Hold on. Let's see if I can figure it out. This is 83. Return of the Jedi is 83. How funny. I don't know. From our limited knowledge and assertion is 1983 is when imperialism. No, we're wrong. I want to see if I can find there's a bit. Yeah, and the Roman Empire still is celebrated. It's like, oh, the greatest thing that ever happened. Okay, I found it. There's a description. It's actually the last line of the play that has always stuck with me. Sorry, I'm gonna cry when I read it. It's really sad. But it's about Laramie, and I think that view that Thea was looking at. So this is the last line of the Laramie project. I'd been up to that site in my limousine, okay? And I remembered to myself the night he and I drove around together, he said to me, Laramie sparkles, doesn't it? And where he was up there, if you sit exactly where he was up there, Laramie sparkles from there with a low-lying cloud. It's the blue lights that bounce off the clouds from the airport, and it goes tss, 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 right over the whole city. I mean, it blows you away. Matt was right there in that spot, and I can just picture him, and I can just picture in his eyes. I can just picture what he was seeing. The last thing he saw on this earth was the sparkling lights. So I think it's so interesting that Laramie exists in like that book and in the play and the plains of Laramie. That's what struck me, was like remembering that like that's where Matthew Shepard died, was like the plains of Laramie. And that's what Thea remembers as America, which is incredibly like deeply saddening. And there's another line in the play that I think of a lot, because people will be like, this isn't my America, like this isn't the America, like this isn't us, and stuff like that. And the line is, we are like this. I don't think I can find it. And even more powerfully, it's spoken by a Muslim woman. Let me see if I can find it. I don't know if I can. Oh, maybe I can. Yeah. Let me read it real quick. Maybe it wasn't the Muslim. Maybe it was. That was on our shirts. That was the shirts. We out here we stand Jessica Pang, an incredible graphic designer and all around wonderful person. I'm going to read this little monologue too, because I've been thinking about it. And it was so good to be with people who felt like shit. And I kept feeling like I don't deserve to feel this bad, you know? And then someone got up there and said, blah, 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 blah. And then he said, I'm saying it wrong, but basically he said, come on, guys, let's show the world that Laramie is not this kind of a town. But it is that kind of a town. If it wasn't this kind of a town, why did this happen here? I mean, you know what I mean, like, that's a lie, because it happened here. So how could it not be a town where this kind of thing happens? Like, that's just totally, like looking at an Escher painting and getting all confused. Like, it's just totally like circular logic. Like, how can you even say that? And we have to mourn this, and we have to be sad that we live in a town, a state, a country where shit like this happens. I mean, these people are trying to distance themselves from this crime, and we need to own this crime, I feel. Everyone needs to own it. We are like this. We are like this. We are like this. So, thoughts. Anyways, I think everyone should make time to read the Laramie Project. I think there's a HBO adaptation, I think. I could be getting it confused with Angels in America. But there's some sort of adaptation of it, which I haven't seen. So if you don't want to read, there's also that. But it's a powerful read. Some plays don't read well, but this play reads well. If that makes sense. Okay. And our final quote of today from How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi is, to love capitalism is to end up loving racism. To love racism is to end up loving capitalism. The conjoined twins are two sides of the same destructive body. So that's all for today. Lots of heavy-hitting thoughts. I'm conflicted about The Song of the Lark as a book. I think it's impossible to view any American literature without without context, I guess, if that makes sense. Like, Edith Wharton's American literature ultimately isn't really about America. It's about one segment of America that she chose to see and that she chose to write about. I'm going long today. And Willa Cather's America is slightly more expanded, but in that expansion is certainly more racist, because of some of the just casually racist things that she'll say or she'll use to describe. And I've been skipping over them if I catch them in time, because I feel like we don't need to hear that. But also, does that let her off the hook for writing it? But I also feel like maybe I'm not equipped enough to really discuss these glancing phrases that she uses, and deconstruct exactly why they're problematic. And I don't know if it's enough to just say that they're problematic, you know? So I'm having some conflicted thoughts. I'd appreciate any non-conflicted or also conflicted thoughts that you have thoughts on that, because I don't know what to do with that. I think it's a thing that requires some more thinking on my part. So I'll make that promise to you to think, and we'll find something that we like. Okay, all right. I will see you guys tomorrow, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Tomorrow, today is Sunday, tomorrow's Monday. I'll see you at 3 for potentially the continuation of the Song of the Lark. But we'll figure it out together. Okay. Thanks for checking in. Wonderful to talk with everybody. Today, just Shiv.